With quick moves and new faces, the military fosters rapid trust among strangers. While we were in Okinawa, a few folks asked me within a week of meeting me whether they could list me as a non-service member emergency contact for their children's daycare or school. They had to list someone other than just themselves and their spouse that was likely to take a call and could potentially pick up a child should the tsunami warning go off or their child develop a fever. I knew I mostly wasn't needed unless the service member went on deployment, when friends were single parenting for months on end. Single service members on deployment experience their own set of challenges. If they deploy from duty stations stateside, they often put their belongings in some kind of temporary storage. That is itself a dicey proposition because some storage facilities are terrible. They have air conditioners that condensate, leak, and make things moldy. Some have inadequate security and break-ins happen. Some are really bad at keeping records and sell off somebody's storage unit even though they're prohibited from doing so by the Service Member Civil Relief Act. Cars present their own special challenge, and dead batteries after deployment are pretty common. When a friend of ours was out of the country for 6 months on one such deployment, I was really good at starting up the car for the first 3.5 months. Then we went out of town for a week and my streak fell apart. I got the battery replaced and I was able to drop his car off for him a few hours before he returned so that he'd be able to drive himself home. Staff Sergeant Cassaberry-Folks was given a similar opportunity to care for a member of his community. When he finally handed the keys over, it wasn't to the airman he was assisting. It was to someone he fraudulently sold the car to. This is Conduct Unbecoming. I'm Erin, and I'm your host. I want to offer a quick listener's note. This case very briefly mentions sexual assault. It's important that I give you the heads up so you can make the choices that work for you. Malik Cassaberry-Folks grew up, from what I can tell, in Brooklyn, New York. There, he played high school basketball, primarily as a shooting guard, and graduated in 2015. After leaving the squeak of a basketball court behind, Cassaberry-Folks joined the Air Force in December 2016 and soon found himself across the country in Northern California, stationed at Travis Air Force Base. Travis hews a little closer to Vacaville than Napa, sort of wedged in between San Francisco and Sacramento. The assignment was Cassaberry-Folks' first duty station, and his first 4 years were unremarkable and uneventful. But he turned full chaos gremlin in July 2020. That month, Cassaberry-Folks began dating a fellow service member, a woman who I'll refer to as Gabrielle. To win Gabrielle over, Cassaberry-Folks took her on dates, which he paid for using his government travel card, a bold choice during a global stop movement order. Although travel was restricted and few were using their government travel cards, it didn't mean the funds were just freed up for personal expenses. And these weren't small occasional purchases, but rather $10,067.56 spent over the course of just 118 days, or about $85 per day on top of whatever he spent from his own salary, which might be safe to assume was all of it. Cassaberry-Folks needed another stream of income, and unlike Perry from episode 50, Cassaberry-Folks didn't pick up a gig job. Instead, he went into sales. In August 2020, while many of us fed our sourdough starters and set up Zoom meetings with family members near and far, Cassaberry-Folks fielded texts and phone calls to facilitate a used car sale. It wasn't his car he was selling, and he didn't work at a lot. Instead, he sold a deployed airman's car. I don't think that this decision was motivated by malice. I think Cassaberry-Folks was wooing a woman and couldn't afford to do it. He kept the $7,000 he received for the car, which I guess shouldn't come as a surprise because that would have been a wildly confusing Venmo transaction since the deployed airman wasn't trying to sell their car. I guess if you factor in that $7,000, it's really $144 a day on top of his salary that he was spending probably on this relationship. That's all to say that for a while the couple really lived the high life. However, 5 months into their relationship, in November 2020, Cassaberry-Folks sexually assaulted Gabrielle after she'd been drinking at a friend's house. While she was bent over a toilet, vomiting, he slapped her butt with his penis. It took until the following month for the two to break up. That assault was not the culmination of Cassaberry-Folks' misdeeds, but rather what we could probably consider a precipitating event. Cassaberry-Folks, nearly $20,000 deep on this relationship, did not take the breakup well. He wanted to recoup some of his lost cash and decided the best way to do that was to give Gabrielle an ultimatum in January 2021. He'd amassed a trove of intimate images from their time together and threatened to pass them around to their squadron mates if she didn't meet his demands. First, he demanded Gabrielle pay him $500. Second, he demanded the return of all gifts he had given her over their approximately 6-month relationship. Third, he demanded additional intimate images of herself. It's not clear how many, if any, of those demands Gabrielle acquiesced to. But it's not really all that relevant to us because we're concerned with Cassaberry-Folks' actions, not hers. It is worth mentioning that circulating those images, had he chosen to do so, would have been revenge porn and is illegal under both the Uniform Code of Military Justice and California law. A few months after giving Gabrielle that ultimatum, on Tuesday, May 4th, Cassaberry-Folks informed his command that he was going to pop out for a quick COVID-19 vaccination. Then, no one heard from him for days. His command grew worried, and on May 7th, they conducted a health and welfare check at his off-base apartment. Inside, they found him intoxicated, but potentially cross-faded on both alcohol and marijuana. Going absent without leave, or AWOL, was the final straw for his command. They couldn't trust him with his travel card, they couldn't trust him with another airman's belongings, they couldn't trust him to keep a vaccination appointment, and frankly, they couldn't trust him to sit in his own home without continuing to get into trouble. Fed up with those antics, they placed him in pretrial confinement at the Solano County Detention Center, or the SCDC. The SCDC is a civilian facility and is run by the California Department of Corrections. It's not a brig. Pursuant to this pretrial confinement, Cassaberry-Folks was required to provide a urinalysis sample during his in-processing. That was untenable for him, and he lunged at one of the 3 security force members involved in processing him. Although the SCDC is run by civilians, there was at least one airman who accompanied Cassaberry-Folks. After he lunged at the security forces, a scuffle ensued in which all 3 security force personnel sustained injuries. 2 suffered only minor abrasions and cuts, but the third, the airman, endured a torn meniscus and partially torn medial cruciate ligament in her knee. She was later medically separated as a result of the injuries, ending her 10-and-a-half-year Air Force career. Though he couldn't know the extent of her injuries at the time, when Cassaberry-Folks was finally restrained and observed the scuffs and cuts, he was amused, and he told everybody to do better and start lifting weights. Cassaberry-Folks didn't like the conditions at the SCDC and requested to be transferred to the detention facility aboard Vandenberg Space Force Base in Santa Barbara. The Air Force Security Forces Center, which, oh my god, try saying that 5 times fast, denied the request, finding there was no legitimate reason for moving him because the Memorandum of Understanding with the civilian facility was still valid. This denial left Cassaberry-Folks at the California Department of Corrections facility, where he asserted he was subjected to 23.5 hours of confinement each day. I don't know how much of this segregation and confinement was due to the raging pandemic. For context, 460,513 Americans died from COVID-19 in May 2021, the month Cassaberry-Folks entered pretrial confinement at the SCDC. Jails, much like dorms, are an epidemiological nightmare with respect to the transmission of a respiratory disease. And it appears that some of the conditions Cassaberry-Folks complained of were quite literally a prison of his own making. He and his attorneys raised concerns about his mental health, and in response to those concerns, the SCDC staff placed Cassaberry-Folks into the medical housing section, which carries with it a heightened level of monitoring from detention facility staff, keeping watch over any medical or mental health concerns. In the run-up to his court-martial, a sanity board determined that Cassaberry-Folks was responsible and competent at both the time that he allegedly committed all of his charged misconduct and at the time he was evaluated. Perhaps observing the likelihood of being convicted, Cassaberry-Folks accepted a plea agreement in February 2021. In accordance with that plea agreement, he pled guilty to one specification of assault consummated by battery against his girlfriend, Gabrielle, one specification of extortion, but really sextortion, one specification of assault consummated by battery for hitting that Air Force non-commissioned officer, two specifications of assault consummated by battery against the two other law enforcement personnel during his processing, one specification of larceny by wrongfully withholding property, and one specification of forgery for selling a car that didn't belong to him, one specification of absence without leave, one specification of wrongful use of controlled substance, which would be two separate instances where he used marijuana at his apartment, and one specification of violating a lawful general regulation, though that specification related to violating regulations on more than one occasion. The plea was structured so that Cassaberry-Folks pled guilty to that assault consummated by battery against Gabrielle instead of abusive sexual contact, a sex offense. To zoom us out a little bit, in total, the government counsel referred 9 charges consisting of 11 specifications against Cassaberry-Folks, and as part of the plea agreement, government counsel agreed they would not seek to prove up the greater offenses, and instead allowed him to plead to the lesser includeds. Following his plea, the court-martial judge sentenced Cassaberry-Folks to 18 months confinement, reduction from E5 to E1, a reprimand, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, and a bad conduct discharge. On appeal, Cassaberry-Folks focused his arguments on the timeliness of his trial and appeal, and the pretrial conditions under which he was held. If the pretrial conditions under which he was held sounds particularly interesting to you, I'd suggest listening to episode 29, The United States versus Craig. Here, the Air Force Court of Criminal Appeals determined that Cassaberry-Folks was entitled to some sentencing relief for the conditions he was confined under at the SCDC. Counsel advanced an argument that the AFCCA should set aside his punitive discharge, which the court found unpersuasive, largely because of the sheer volume of the misconduct Cassaberry-Folks committed. He'd already served his time, but by reassessing his confinement credits and assigning him additional credits, the AFCCA believed he could be entitled to some form of monetary relief. The court determined he'd experienced 129 days of inappropriate confinement conditions. In a footnote, though, the court observed that even if he didn't receive financial remuneration for those 129 confinement days, they still wouldn't set aside his punitive discharge, and I like that they took that opportunity to really cover their bases. In addition to alleging that the government took too long to take his case to trial, Cassaberry-Folks contended that he faced excessive post-trial delay. It's a topic we've looked at together before, in episode 40, The United States versus Abdullah. Much like that case, the AFCCA got spicy with the dilatory post-trial processing of a relatively small record of trial, and reduced Cassaberry-Folks' sentence. Again, the court observed that there was no reason for the protracted delay, rejected the government's explanation, and reamed them for inexperience and failures up and down the chain of command. To best express their ire, the AFCCA rejected the confinement sentence and wholly rejected the forfeitures of all pay and allowances. This left just the reprimand, reduction from E5 to E1, and the bad conduct discharge as Cassaberry-Folks' sentence. I'm of two minds about this outcome, mostly because so much of the misconduct here was financial fraud. I don't see anything in the appellate opinion about paying back the $10,000 that he owed the government. But I guess the benefit to giving him back pay is that he could use it to satisfy any debts. I'm mostly curious about how the deployed airman gets made whole in this scenario. Whether they had to sue Cassaberry-Folks civilly or if there's some other arrangement that's been made. I guess my main takeaway from this case is that Cassaberry-Folks made a bad airman, a bad boyfriend, and a bad friend. A real triple threat. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it. I invite you to submit case suggestions and feedback to conductunbecomingpod@gmail.com or on conductunbecomingpod.com. Join me next time when we revisit Roots with a bewildering case and celebrate the start of the third season, by which I mean the third year, of Conduct Unbecoming. Until then, take care. Conduct Unbecoming is a podcast where I get to talk about interesting crimes and cases that involve U.S. military service members. I research, write, and produce the podcast myself. The opinions expressed are my own, and perhaps it's obvious. Conduct Unbecoming is not approved, authorized, or endorsed by the Department of Defense.